US. It's lovely to see such a big crowd here again. Just a few housekeeping rules first. So anybody who hasn't been here before, we have exits just there, out the back and out there. So follow staff members, myself, Nigel or Anthony, if we do hear any alarms going off, but we're not expecting any. Bathrooms are out the back door and through that door to the right, so go straight through. So we're excited, we're back in 2026. And today is all about District Heat. So just a rough agenda, we're going to have Pauline O'Reilly up first. We're going to have follow that with David Connolly, and then we're going to have a discussion with both of them, and then we finally close for networking. So I'm going to introduce Pauline first. So Pauline is CEO of the Irish District Industry Association, which represents the emerging district heating sector in Ireland. She's a Galwegian, has been a senator and chair of the Green Party, as well as a solicitor and an advocate for numerous projects in the city. District heating received its first round of development funding during her tenure. Pauline is passionate about decarbonisation in the heat sector in Ireland. She aims to discuss the potential, particularly in the west of Ireland, to centralise zero carbon heating, particularly for large energy users. So can we please welcome Pauline to the stage, please.
Lower this a little bit for myself. Thanks so much to everybody for coming here to join us today. I'm not using slides. I'm going to wing it, and I'm going to try to use my political background to do so. Look, I joined the organisation, the Irish District Energy Association, less than a year ago. But I did it because I was really, really passionate, as most of you in this room are, about decarbonisation. And it was a real shock to me to hear how badly Ireland is doing when it comes to heat. Pretty much every building across the country is generating its own heat, which is just seems crazy and illogical that each one of us has our own boiler that we have to maintain, that we have to change out. And then when you look at something like a university, something like a hospital, they've got these massive boiler rooms that need to be serviced and operated, and that could be used for something else, such as, lo and behold, patient care, for instance. And at the moment in Ireland, what we're doing is we're giving out grants. The government's giving out grants to each one of us to operate our own system, our own network. So if you look at a university, for instance, and they're looking at the options and they're saying, well, what's out there, I want to decarbonise, I've got my targets, and they can get grants for individual heat pumps to go in each individual building. But does this make any sense? Well, if you look across Europe, it's not what the rest of Europe is doing. Ireland's at the very, very bottom. We have less than 1% district heating, which I'll explain in a second. And then we've got other countries, we look at Copenhagen, which is over 90% district heating. So it can be done, the technology's out there, but what hasn't happened in Ireland is that the policy hasn't supported an industry in development. And I often use the example of solar panels. When we went into government first, remember Ian Ryan said, solar panels will never take off. What we need to do is really push other kind of renewable energy. Like I just felt, once people see something and they see that it works for someone else, then they go, that's something that I could have. My street, there are 7 houses that have solar panels. You go 2 streets away and not one house has it. And there's no real difference between it other than we're neighbours and we chat when we're out with the kids on the green. And in a way, that's the way I think we need to look at something like district heating, or in fact anything when it comes to decarbonisation. It has to be a conversation starter. We have to see examples and see that it works for other people. So district heating is effectively taking the millions of individual heat networks, i.e. in each one of our homes, and instead consolidating it and having a heat network that is outside of an individual building, and it supplies the heat to multiple buildings. And it can be as far as an entire city, or it could be a town, or it could be a group of houses. It really is the exact same system as you would expect in your house. And I mean, I use house as an example, but in fact what we'll see is that it's going to be the large energy users that will be first onto the district heating network, like universities, like schools, like prisons, like council buildings. And one example, and we spoke about this earlier, about Tala. So Tala is a really good demonstrator project in Ireland. If people haven't been to see the Tala District Heating Centre, you really should go and have a look. It is minuscule, but it's actually architecturally beautiful. You have a heat centre, and that's where that's where you basically generate the heat. But right next to it you have an Amazon data centre. And then right across the road you've got TU Dublin, the Technical University of Dublin, and you've got a council building. You've also got it connected up for social housing unit and for an apartment block. So that's a kind of a minuscule example of what a district heating network looks like. You've still got all the various bits that you would have in a building if you had your own heat pump, or your own fire, or your own gas boiler. You've just got it in at a larger scale, and you don't each individually have that within your house. And I remember talking to David, who lived in Copenhagen for a long time, and he said, if you asked people in Copenhagen, nobody would be able to tell you how district heating works or how they get their heating. So in fact, we kind of obsess here about where we get our heating from. Some of that is cultural, I think, going back to peat or coal, and some of it is because of the oil crisis. But in fact, when it comes to something like your electricity or your water, you don't really question where it comes from. It comes in a pipe to your house, and then you use it. That's where we should be getting to when it comes to heat, because we're doing a really bad job in Ireland of decarbonising heat. Yes, there's incentives for individual heat pumps, but the actual rollout of that is really, really difficult, because what you're doing is you're asking each individual person to make a choice, and that's not a good approach to policy. It's part of the solution. Individual heat pumps are part of the solution, but they're not all of the solution. So the target for district heating in Ireland is to get from less than 1% to 10% by 2030. Now, that's not really achievable, not at this stage. There hasn't been any money, and I gave that example earlier where you can get a grant to put in an individual heat pump, but you can't get a grant for district heating. So none of the actual policy levers have been put in place to push this over the line. Everyone thinks it's a great idea. Once they know what district heating is, although when I walk around Leinster House now, I'm still having to explain. I think most people have caught on, but when I started the job first, they said, "What are you doing, Pauline? What is this?" You know, it's when you don't see something, it's really hard to imagine what it is. So what we look to do in the Irish District Energy Association is to ensure that a few projects get over the line. Other people can say, a little bit like the solar panels, look what they've got in Monaghan, look what they've got in Galway. We'd love that in our town, in our city. And I think that's really where we will grow this industry. So what has happened over the last number of months is there's a piece of legislation going through the Oireachtas which would allow licensing to be much more straightforward, we hope, fingers crossed. But that piece of legislation isn't actually needed to get district heating up and running. Really what we need is that piece around the funding, and that piece around really people buying in, the credibility, understanding what it is. So it's an education piece. We got pre-development funding allocated of 5 million. Now that is a drop in the ocean, everybody understands, but that was what we looked for. Actually it was 5 million because we thought it was achievable to get from the department without having to go through a long process. 40 projects, I believe, put in for that fund. That really supports people to get to a planning stage. The costs for councils, for instance, around legal and consulting fees, that's what actually stops them getting to the next stage. And we also got agreement then for a larger pot of 100 million over the next few years from the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. And that will allow a few of those projects to get the funding in place that is required, I guess, to start building these, because it's not the same as an individual heat pump, in the sense that you've got to put pipes in the ground, you've got to have a building there to put the heat network in. So there's an upfront cost. Now, once those things have been put in place, then you can build out. So you can have the university, a hospital, all on a district heating network, and then in a few years' time, there might be housing estates that decide they want to come on board, and that's how you roll it out over time. And the cost is very little once you have the established heat centre. So that's really where we are in Ireland. There was a lot of excitement in IrDEA. We got a lot of new members towards the end of last year, because what you need to do is to show your investors that there is commitment from the Irish government. And I think that commitment is there now. It shows that it's worth taking the punt, it's worth taking the risk, because the Irish government now has it as part of their policy, and so the risks are really on them to get this over the line. So I'm not going to do too much more talking, because I know several people here are from Galway and will want to hear about the Galway project. But I'm happy to take questions afterwards. But I suppose just to finish up, what I'd say is, when we kind of started talking about district heating a number of years ago, and we were quite passionate about it in the last government, at that time people were talking about the environment, and they were talking about climate change, and that really mattered on a policy level. Things have shifted now. Those things matter more than ever. We can see with the floods, those things matter more than ever. The targets are still there, the Climate Act is still there, and everything has to be done in order to decarbonise. But what we also now do is we talk about energy security and supporting the customer a lot more. I think that's good. I think it's really positive that all of those things are brought together. But in the current geopolitical situation, having our own heat sources in our own country, in our own locality, is more important than ever. And that's what Scandinavian countries are, fearful of. That's why the rollout has been so successful in some of those countries. And I think now every country needs to be looking at energy security. This is the easiest way to roll it out. We know not every building in the country is going to be suitable for district heating, but the kind of work that we've done shows that over 50% are. If we could get to 50%, that would be a no-brainer. And of course, I couldn't talk about district heating without talking about data centres. So Ireland's use of electricity for data centres, we all know it's in the 20s, it's set to increase to 30%. But they are actually not only large energy users, they are large energy providers if we allow them and if we provide the tools for them to do that. There is enough waste heat in the country to heat every single building in the country, and yet what's happened to all of that waste heat from the processing? It's going right up into the atmosphere, or it's going into our water. So it's not toxic, but it's just wasteful. Why not use that? So that's the number one. If you can find a waste heat source, that's what you'd use for district heating. It's not always possible, so geothermal, air to water, biomass, they are all alternatives. But one way or the other, the district heating in Ireland will only use either renewable sources or waste sources. That's where we have a little bit of an advantage compared to other European countries. They're having to transition away from coal, away from oil and gas on their district heating networks. We're only starting, so we can do it right from the start. So thanks so much for your attention. I'm going to hand over to David to talk about the local opportunity here, but I hope there'll be lots of questions later. For many people, district heating is a new concept. It was for me, so I know exactly how people feel. But I think that once we see a few projects operational, it'll just all click into place. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Pauline. We're going to have a panel discussion after David's talk too, so we'll dig a bit more into what we need to do to achieve those 10% targets, a bit more about how we can make the West a flagship. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the room will be from public sectors, local authorities or large energy users at the moment? Okay, so this could be very, very interesting discussion later then. Now I'm just going to introduce David. So David is currently CEO of IrDEA Ireland, which is developing low carbon district heating networks in Ireland, and he's also the chairperson of the Irish District Energy Association, which he actually co-founded in 2017. He previously worked as an associate professor in Aalborg University in Denmark, where he specialised in national energy planning and in particular the potential for district heating across Europe. He led the Heat Roadmap Europe project, which underpinned the first heating and cooling strategy ever developed by the European Commission. He then returned to Ireland from Denmark in 2017 and went on to become CEO of Wind Energy Ireland, which is Ireland's largest association, where he also worked in the delivery of solar, PV and high temperature heat pumps for industrial customers, including as part of the team which delivered Ireland's and the UK's first ever heat pump supply over 100 degrees Celsius. So please welcome David, everyone.
Afternoon all, and most importantly, I was born in Galway, but from here. So I wasn't born too far from here, and one of the scars I carry as a Mayo man is Galway is on my passport as my place of birth. But I grew up in Mayo, so not too far from here. And it is only just somewhat by coincidence that our first ever project is in Galway, and that was more not because I was born right across the road over in Newcastle, but because it appeared as a really good opportunity to meet all the criteria that we would look for when we try to find a district heating project, and that's what I'll talk a little bit about today. So who we are in IrDEA Ireland is we try to develop greenfield district heating projects, and what I mean by greenfield is we go to cities where there is no existing district heating. So it is a very useful thing to be from Mayo when you're trying to do that, because you need a lot of resilience. We are all resilience professionals in Mayo after many years of hope. So it is a difficult thing to do. It's not easy to do. You're starting with a blank page. You're trying to create what would be the first ever pipe in the ground. You're trying to get the first ever pipe in the ground. But it is very much a development project because nothing exists when you arrive. And it's very different to what many other European projects or European countries deal with, which is there's 70 million people with district heating in Europe today, so a lot of other countries and cities have some initial network that they're working with, and they're trying to expand it out and make it bigger. Whereas in Ireland, as Pauline said, we're starting with almost very little. We have 2 kilometres of pipework that you would define as district heating level in the whole country. Where I lived in Copenhagen, which is the size of Dublin, had 3,000 kilometres alone. Cities the size of Galway in Denmark would typically have somewhere between 500 to 800 kilometres of pipework today. So that gives you some kind of sense of just how little we have, even though the industry as a whole is very well established across Europe. But what we do is not go into cities where there's some network already and try and make it bigger or better. We start in places where there's nothing. So in that context, Ireland is a wonderful opportunity. It is very, very little. This process will take typically about 4 to 5 years, I would say, is in places that are other countries. I think in Ireland it's a bit unknown as to how long it will exactly take for a project because we're putting so much of the foundations in place as we go. But I'll give you an example of one of our UK projects where from, let's say, first concept right through to heat on, it was about 4 years in total, and I'll show you some of that later. Once you, to go through that, we as HeatGrid fund these projects, so we find them, we identify what they should be, we then fund them and we build them, and then after they're built, we run them. So we are here from cradle to grave. We come along to find projects that we intend to be there to operate and run, which is very important because it means day one when we arrive, we're very worried about what the product is going to be at the end. So we're very conscious that this is something we're not just going to have to build, but we're going to have to make sure it runs correctly and can grow and sustain itself over time. It's set up by myself and a company called Asper Investment Management, who've been in Ireland for about 20 years working on wind energy. So as my introduction that Yvonne kindly gave, I worked as CEO of the Wind Energy Association for a number of years. Asper would have one of the largest shares of onshore wind constructed in Ireland over the last 20 years, so got to know the team there very well during that time. And it just so happens that we both had a love affair for district heating pipes. They've had a number of businesses in other parts of Europe, Sweden, the Netherlands and the UK. I had lived in the fabulous Copenhagen and seen the dream of what district heating can provide. And we both, about 2.5 years ago, decided to set up Heat Grid Ireland when we saw an opportunity emerging in the shift towards district heating in the decarbonisation of heat in Ireland landscape. So about 2.5 years ago, you could see there was a lot of focus starting to move on district heating. I would say two really important things happened. I think one is the gas crisis came along, and during the gas crisis of 2022, district heating prices, so heat for individuals in Scandinavia, you can look up the data yourself, prices stayed perfectly flat through that entire time. So while we were here on the end of a gas pipe suffering from 5 to 10-fold increases in our costs of heat, district heating was enabling people to get through that without those fluctuations because it doesn't rely on imported fossil fuels from around other parts of the world. As Pauline highlighted, your main aim is to use local renewable sources which can give you a much more stable price, and hopefully someday that's what we can see in the Galway project. So that, I think, triggered a huge amount of focus back on district heating. There was an awful lot of discussions around Europe at that time around why are these countries in Scandinavia not suffering like the rest of Europe when it came to the gas prices. Why were they able to maintain relatively stable prices while the rest of us were really suffering? And I think that brought a renewed focus on what is this technology that's working in that part of the world. And then that's what initiated a lot, I think, of momentum here in Ireland as well as to why this is something we should look at in more detail. So when we could see that momentum building, we set up Heat Grid Ireland to look at, well, what projects could we establish around the country, and Galway being one of the most well advanced at this stage. I think the other thing that was happening in parallel to that is there was a lot of things happening right across the Irish Sea in the UK that they were working with for quite some time without being able to see things happening at pace. So throughout the 2010s, the UK had made a number of attempts to try and accelerate the development of district heating in various cities, but were really struggling to mobilise it at pace, whereas the new grant scheme that was brought in England in the early 2020s has seen a huge uplift in the pace at which district heating projects have both taken off, but also started to be delivered. And I suppose we, watching this progress in England over the early 2020s, could see that there's almost been a flick moment here where policy has figured out how to mobilise the district heating industry in a context where there's no district heating projects there already, which is a very important context to continuously think about. You know, it's not much help to Ireland looking to Denmark and Sweden for inspiration as to how to get district heating started, because they did it 40 years ago, and it's a totally different context. It's very helpful to look to countries like England, where they have a very similar backdrop to us, which is almost no pipes in the ground, lots of gas boilers in their cities, and they're trying to start with nothing and create the first pipes. So I suppose this momentum that was building in England in the early 2020s, combined with this focus at EU level of how district heating is something that can really help with energy security and decarbonisation, was very much the inspiration for setting up Heat Grid 2.5 years ago, and hope that this momentum would flow through to the Irish policy landscape, which Pauline, no small part due to the work that she's doing herself, we're starting to really see the shoots emerge over the last 12 to 18 months of that actually happening. And just going into the detail, like these projects that you see listed up here, 5 years ago, none of these existed. So 5 years ago, when this grant scheme was launched in England, none of these cities had projects that were real in terms of district heating, and 5 years later, this grant scheme that was launched in 2021, I think was the first ever time they ran the initial phase of it, has now funded over 50 projects with a value of over 1.6 billion across a number of cities, that has created a lot of projects getting started and being constructed. And that's one of the companies that's been successful at getting some of those grants and getting some of those projects started is our sister company in the Asper group called One Energy. So these are some of the projects that they're working on live at the moment, and that has proved to be a huge inspiration for us and a huge, really valuable learning curve for us to be able to look to see what challenges do they have in this world of trying to put in the first pipes, and how can we learn from that in heat grid as we move from development stage into construction stage. I just want to give you a flavour of the type of things they deal with day to day. You know, I often go into meetings and people say, geez David, you're hardly going to deal with the roads, there's loads of utilities. Well, you can see on the right hand side, it's not going to be the first time we've had to deal with these type of things. This is Bradford, which is one of the most advanced projects we have in the UK. And it's an old, very, very old city, with and the pipework is going right through the city centre. So you can see on the right hand side the type of utilities that they've had to navigate the pipework through, and the type of streets that you have to try and put pipework into. So yes, it's a challenge, but not impossible. And this is what the world is going to look like for any cities that are starting with nothing, because you have 100 years of utilities that got there before you. But it is possible. So I suppose it's just to give people a flavour of, we will not be the first people in Ireland to try and put pipes into a city that has never had anyone try and do it before. We have a huge amount of learnings we can take, in particular from the last 5 years, in what they're doing with all these projects in England. And I think that can give us a huge amount of advantages in terms of learning from their experiences of breaking into new roads. And this particular project, the reason I also mention it is it's almost identical in scale, size and design of what we're doing in the Galway project. So that people can kind of get a flavour of what one of these will likely look like over time. This is the timeline of that project, and something I really always like to share, because I think in Ireland people think it takes 20 years to put a pipe in the street, and it doesn't. It takes 20 years to talk about putting a pipe in the street, but when you actually get to do it, it's quite quick. So the hard part is to stop the talking and start the doing, because once you start the doing, it actually can be done relatively quickly. Irish utilities are put in the street all the time. Water, telecoms, electrical cables, gas networks. There's an awful lot of transferable skills from the contractors that do that on a day-to-day basis to what we would need to do. It's drilling a trench in the street and putting something into the trench and closing it back up. Other than some specialist welding, everything else is very much the same. So it doesn't take decades to do something like this. It typically is months and maybe years if it's a very big project. And I think instead of talking hypotheticals, picking a project like Bradford I think is very helpful, because it's real. This is what has actually happened. So the first time they ever proposed this project or developed the concept for it was in August 2022, where they put forward an initial concept to that grant scheme that had just started in England, and fast-tracked to 2026. In September they're planning to go live. So that's 4 years from first conversation to heat on. That is incredibly different to what I would say most Irish people think the timeline is for a district heating project. I think most conversations I have, people would measure in 4 decades and not 4 years, but it doesn't have to be like that. That is not physics, or it's not contractor capability. It is absolutely possible that we can do something similar to this in Ireland. There's probably lots of things that would make it easier, but I wouldn't say that it's currently even impossible to do this, even today. So like there's things being worked on, as Pauline mentioned, about heat bills and other regulatory frameworks that certainly can make it faster than we currently could do it today. You know, but it isn't impossible to do it, and hence why we're progressing with projects like Galway. So in heat grid we have a number of projects around the country that we are bringing through the early feasibility, concept design, planning submission phase. So the very first planning application we submitted was for Galway towards the end of last year. We hope to have another 2 this year, so you can watch this space, and we're working on those as we speak. But Galway was our first to make it to that milestone, and that is simply due to a factor of how quickly we were able to develop the project. Like, it wasn't a strategic decision to pick Galway over any other. It was in the pipeline that we were developing. This was the one that developed the quickest out of all we were working on. And I think some of that is just due to the local conditions that made district heating very attractive for that part of Galway East over by the Dublin Road. So the first thing when you look at district heating, these are the very fundamentals. I would say you have the left and the right that you need to piece together. How are you going to produce the heat, and where are you going to deliver the heat? And back to what Pauline mentioned earlier, there's certain parts of the country that district heating will just never be suitable. So I think if you want an easy guide as a starter, anywhere there's a gas network is likely up for discussion. Anywhere there isn't a gas network is likely out of discussion. So that's at least a first yardstick, because the reason we built gas grids is because buildings were located close enough together to justify putting a grid in the ground and connecting things together. The reason we don't build gas grids in the middle of the countryside is houses are too far apart to justify having a grid connecting everyone together. So as a first rule of thumb, you could say in Ireland, anywhere there's a gas grid is likely to be worth considering for district heating. And so it's urban areas. I think the other thing just to mention is, Denmark is 5 million people. We're not far off 5 million people. They have 300 district heating networks, down as far as any town that's probably around 5,000 people or more. So it's not a city solution. I think people would often say to me, when I talk in Ireland, they think it's Dublin, Cork, Galway only, and then anything after the cities is likely too small. If you go to Scandinavia, you're down to 5,000 people levels, is where it tends to stop. I absolutely can't see Ireland starting there. I think it'll be a long time before we get to that point, but it's just to set the boundaries around what's possible. So cities are definitely the most suitable and definitely the easiest place to start, but mid-sized towns are absolutely open for investigation, and we have many projects we're looking at in places that are not necessarily the big urban centres of Ireland. But when you do go and look at a city, or you do go and look at an area, this is the matrix you're trying to match together. You're trying to look at what kind of heat sources do I have locally that are low carbon, sustainable, that are competitive because customers will not pay any price, and what customers are in the area that need a relatively large amount of heat to get started. And this is probably a very important thing to mention. When you look at an area, you need a small number of large users to get started, because you have a very long development cycle to go through. You have to go through in concept design, planning permissions, licensings, construction programs, and as I say, during that 4 to 5 year time horizon, you can only bring a small group of people through all of that uncertainty. And you tend to start with a small number of what we call anchor customers. But when you design the network, and same as our approach in Galway East, you design the network to be able to expand to provide the whole area over time. So you're always looking with a 20 to 30 year horizon of how will this network densify. So you kind of have there's two things driving your analysis when you look at a place earlier on. One is just how do you start it with a few customers, but then how do you future-proof it for what's needed for 30, 40 years down the road, because you're never digging the street again. You put that pipe in the ground, you do not want to see it for 50, 60 years. So if you get it, you're lucky enough to get a chance to dig once, you want that to be your last for a very, very long period of time. So you're kind of always, when you come into an area, you're looking at customers with two lenses. You're looking at who can I connect straight away today just to get the project up and running, but how do I ensure that my project is future-proofed for this area as things evolve over the next 30, 40 years. And then on the other side, in terms of sources, you have a very clear hierarchy. So if you can find waste heat, that's the best in the business. So IrDEA did a study about 4 or 5 years ago where we looked at how much waste heat exists in Ireland. And you kind of have to sit down for this one, and you'll be sitting having your dinner later and be saying, you can't be after saying that, but there was actually more waste heat available than heat needed to heat every building in Ireland. And that's kind of a bit mad when you stew on it for a while. Going through a gas crisis, getting extortionate prices for paying for heat, knowing that actually at the same time there was more heat being thrown into the sky and into the rivers and seas around the country that we would need to heat every building. And you can actually go right down to when we did that piece of work a few years back, the River Liffey alone had enough heat going in to heat all of Dublin. So you can really drill into very specific numbers in specific areas and get some eye-watering numbers around just the scale of heat that's lost through different processes around the country. But you can't use it if you don't have the pipes. So that's the tricky part. So there is all of these heat and it's all being lost through various different places, but how do you get it from where it is into buildings if you don't have hot water pipe. And that is probably the single biggest benefit that district heating has over a gas grid. A gas grid can only take gas, and you're really stuck, you're kind of locked into that product, there's a monopoly on that product. Hot water can be heated in many different ways. Hot water can be produced, all of these are just some of the options and the different ways you can produce hot water. So if you're making hot water with wood chip, and that becomes a problem, you can switch it very quickly over to a heat pump. And if electricity becomes a problem, you can switch it over to solar thermal. And if you look at the historical way that people produced district heating in different countries around Europe, you can almost see the geopolitical situation at the time shaped what type of sources were being fed into these district heating systems. So once upon a time it was oil, then you had the oil crisis, then it turned to gas, then you had security of supply, then it turned to wood chip, then you had electrification, and now it's turned to electricity. So you can see these different sources over time changing, and that's the way district heating evolves. It's not locked into one particular way of doing it. But we have to pick something to get started. So in a perfect world, and what we always look for first is some kind of waste heat, but in the location we're in Galway, we don't have a waste heat source readily available to us, so we've used an air source heat pump in that project because we have the air. But in time, we would absolutely expect that as that network evolves, waste heat may become available from different places. Somebody might have something in a factory that we never knew existed, or might be developed. A data centre may come to Galway at some point, and then if we have the pipes, we have the facility to use that. But if we don't have the pipes, we can join the never-ending queue of other waste heat in the country that goes unused. So Galway has as its energy source an air source heat pump as our way to produce the decarbonised heat. And this is the project that we submitted for planning. So we have an energy centre along the Dublin Road in the square blue box, where we'll produce energy for the entire network, which is about 8 kilometres east to west. And it'll supply heat at about 80 degrees Celsius. So for the vast majority of the customers, it's taking, if any of you are familiar with plant rooms, you'll have a boiler feeding onto a header. We literally are putting a heat exchanger beside that feeds directly onto that existing header. So it's not always as simple as just plug and play, but it's a lot easier than if you had to retrofit a heat pump or something else into the building, because you're getting a like for like in terms of heat coming to your building and being taken away. In the planning application, we unfortunately don't get all the wonderful exemptions that other utilities get, because unfortunately I think district heating hasn't been thought about in Ireland, and this is one of the things that will make life easier in time. But you don't need planning permission for electricity cables or gas networks or water infrastructure in Ireland or exempted development, but district heating isn't on the list, I would say, just because it was never part of the conversation when the list was being made. So we have to apply for planning permission for not just the energy centre where we produce the heat, but for the network that we propose to put in the ground. That obviously creates a huge amount of additional design and analysis work you need to do, because you have to be pretty sure that you can put the pipe where you get planning permission to put the pipe. So a lot of work went into looking at what the route should be, where the route should go, getting consent from people who are the landowners of strips along that route. So it is very useful being from Mayo. There's a lot of resilience you need to go through all of these different things, and but delightfully we pieced that together and put in the application in November, and we got a decision earlier this month that there's one FI that we're currently working on that we need to go back with in the coming weeks and months, which we think should be all okay to do. So hopefully we'll be back in the not so distant future with that. This was the reason we came to that part of Galway. So none of these customers are officially part of the project. It's a chicken and egg that we need to make the project real before we can get customers to sign up to the project. But this is the basis as to why we looked at Galway East. These, back to what I was saying about you look for anchors initially that could help you start the project, and then you can densify it over time. These were the short list of anchors we identified in this area that made it an area that we felt was worth developing for a district heating project. So this is a bit unusual, I would say. It's not often, like even in Dublin, if you map out distances, the distance between large heat users tends to be further apart because it's quite a big city. Galway being, it's a big city, but it's actually quite small, probably because of the area it services. Like we all go to Galway for everything, so there's quite a lot of things in a relatively compact area. So within this 6, 7, 8 kilometre stretch along the Dublin Road, you have 3 hospitals, a number of hotels, you have a university campus, you have a number of large industrial facilities. Like that is a relatively small distance we'd ever see in comparison to many other cities to have that volume of large users. So, you know, Galway as a city itself, maybe not huge in the grand scheme of things, but there's actually quite a large number of large heat users within a small distance of one another. So that was the basis on which we began developing this project, was that there's this potential to connect these initial anchors, subject them to them signing up at some point in the future as the project becomes more certain. And then we've designed the network that it can service all of the buildings within this Roscam/Renmore area. So when we design the pipework, we don't just design it to do the anchors day one, we oversize some of the spine route to be able to service then the area over time as it develops. So this is the planning application. It's available everywhere to the public, so you can either go on our website or you can go on the Galway City Council website and you'll be able to download and see what exactly you apply for and have built it together. Then I'll probably wrap up soon, I'm conscious of time, but this, I would say, is the benefits that we outlined that district heating can bring. So for the customers, we offer them a way to decarbonise without needing to upgrade their electrical capacity, which is for many customers a major limiting factor. So a lot of people looking to decarbonise at the moment are looking to heat pumps to do that, but a lot of people are really struggling to get additional electrical capacity because there's so much constraints on the grid at present after many years without sufficient upgrades. So the other thing that happens there is it's not just about saving the customer having to get that additional capacity. The customer can use whatever capacity they have for their core business, which is what people tend to want to reserve their electricity capacity for. And the other thing is that we tend to need an awful lot less electrical capacity than everyone would need if they did it themselves individually, because we have a diversity factor. We're sharing the capacity between lots of people. So what I mean by that is our energy centre to service this area of Galway has a multiple less electricity that it needs because we're sharing the heat across so many different people. So we don't have to have everyone's peak at the same time. People have peaks at different times. So this diversity factor means we need much less electricity to do our heat pump than people would need if they all did it individually. And that's a really big benefit to EirGrid and ESB networks these days, where electricity capacity is really in short supply. So there's the kind of system-wide benefit of sharing the capacity, and then there's the individual benefit to the customer that they don't have to get it themselves or take it away from core business. We don't need fabric upgrades for most people, so that's a huge benefit. Because we're supplying 80-degree heat, typically into a heating system that requires 80 degrees, you don't have to go and do what can be extensive, very expensive and take very long time. Fabric, windows, doors, external insulation can take a long time. It doesn't prevent you from doing it later, it just means you don't have to do it up front in order to decarbonise. No carbon monoxide on site. I think it's one of the most underrated benefits of district heating in Ireland. I know of a friend at home who had a child that died from carbon monoxide in their home. We have a singing chicken on our TVs all the time, singing about how dangerous that is. You know, I think that's, district heating takes all of that out of your building. You no longer have a furnace or a burner or anything in your home. So I think that's a huge benefit for people. And I actually have a picture here. It only dawned on me one time when a friend of mine showed it to me. This is a picture of Dublin on the left and a picture of Copenhagen on the right. And you may notice there's no chimneys in Copenhagen. So there's nothing being burnt in the buildings because they're just receiving heat. They're not actually burning any fuel. And I think that's just something we often underrate in Ireland, as you know, we bring something into our home that is effectively lethal, whereas district heating takes all of that out of the home. We outsource expertise for the customer, so we become the people who have to deliver the energy project, not individual customers. I think trying to decarbonise is difficult and it's complicated, and people who are trying to do it often have huge challenges trying to figure out what's the right thing to do and how is the right way to approach it. When do I buy my electricity? How do I manage my heat pump? We take all of that and effectively outsource it to a pipe that people get to their door. And that goes with effort and timing as well. You know, it's up to us to deliver the projects to a milestone, no longer up to the client to do it themselves. So that's the ways I think we make the decarbonisation journey easier for customers. For the city, better air quality. It's back to that picture I showed you of the chimneys. You know, I think the EPA publish a report every year that says 1,500 people in Ireland die from air pollution or die earlier than expected. I think it's in that ballpark of number from air pollution in our urban areas, mainly burning of fuels for heating. You know, that is not to be missed as a benefit for a wider city, that you get to reduce the amount of air pollution in the area. Less carbon emissions for a wider society. We could attract future waste heat, you know, as in if there's a network, I can tell you this from seeing it in many cities around Europe, when a network is in a city and providing heat to people that have waste heat see that as an opportunity to put their businesses near those, because then they see it as a benefit for their business, that they can offer a social good or potentially a revenue, depending on what exactly it is. There's a city in the very, very west of Denmark called Esbjerg, or to say it in English version, you might say Esbjerg, and it's a port town with a large offshore business, very similar in size to Galway, but they would have had 7 or 8 different types of heat in their energy centre at this point after 40 years of different people coming in and out through different cycles. But the most recent one that they're doing is there's a very large hydrogen production facility being built in that area, and they purposely decided to put it beside that city so that the waste heat off all the hydrogen production could be delivered into the city as a waste heat byproduct. If that district heating network didn't exist, I'd be pretty certain they wouldn't have located themselves so close to that city, because they wouldn't have seen any benefit from being there. And that's expected to supply somewhere between half and 2/3 of the city's entire heat needs as a byproduct. So you can imagine what their heat prices are going to do when that facility comes online, and they'll be really low cost heat for the city. And then we're investing in local infrastructure. And then cost-wise, I would say we cannot beat natural gas. You know, that's just unfortunate that fossil fuel is so cheap and the infrastructure has been put in the ground. But we are absolutely the cheapest way to decarbonise. So district heating and sharing the economies of scale is the cheapest way for a city or large anchors to decarbonise their buildings. Hopefully in time, decarbonisation will be cheaper than fossil fuels. But right now today in Ireland, we just have very cheap fossil fuels. And you have a sunk cost already put into the network for gas. And it's very hard to beat that when you're starting with a blank sheet. So we can't beat gas, but we can offer the lowest price way to decarbonise. And that in itself, I think, is very good value for a lot of anchor customers that we deal with. And we also take away the OpEx of having to maintain and service your own boilers, like Pauline, I think, referred to. I think I'll skip the last few. I think there's a few more, but sure, we can maybe take it up in the panel, because I'm quite conscious we're heading towards the 4 o'clock, so I'll leave it there.
I think we might have a couple of questions online for you. Anyone in the room got any questions?
Do you want Pauline or something?
Yeah. All right.
No, don't make them too hard, you know. Who had their hand up?
A question for David.
Yeah, sure.
Very exciting. I'm Paul Monaghan at University of Galway. Just on the air source heat pump, delivering at that high temperature, what kind of coefficient of performance are you expecting from that?
So typically around 3 would be what we're aiming for, because I would say it's probably like, you know, it's like comparing, say if you take the electricity analogy, the heat pump in your house is like the generator out the back of the house, and what we're dealing with is a power plant. So it's it's a much more robust piece of technology. So they're all called a heat pump. The heat pump you see in the back of someone's house, it's called a heat pump. What we're putting in is called a heat pump, but the quality and the grade of what we're putting in is more like something you'd see as a truck engine to look at. It's like you know, when you see what it is, it's a very, very solid piece of equipment, very strong and very robust, because it's designed to run 24/7 for 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
You know, so they're all called the same product, they're all named a heat pump, but it's a very different grade of quality, because it's such a high quality unit, we can get those COPs from an air source system at that kind of temperature lift, whereas you'd never do that with and it's a totally different type of compressor, a totally different setup to what you'd be used to in a residential setting. So all cold heat pumps all do thermodynamically the same thing, but a very different grade of quality of machine that goes in for us versus what goes into a residential setting, and for that reason we'd be aiming for in and around the 3.
We've got one from online. Unmute, please. Just ask your question.
Apologies. Yes. Thanks, Yvonne. A great presentation, David and Pauline, as usual. 2 questions, if you don't mind. The first one is in relation to DESNZ and Ofgem earlier this week have announced their decision on zoning. So they're going to zone towns and areas in GB that where district heating is the ideal heating and decarbonisation solution, and they're going to make it mandatory for certain types of buildings to connect. I'm just wondering, what's your view on whether Ireland should go down that route? And apologies, second question now, just in relation to the comment there that the district heat networks, the prices that customers pay are not volatile. So even if the example you had there was Esbjerg in Denmark. So the waste heat comes from the electrolyzers. It's upgraded via that large industrial heat pump. That's a large electricity user. So in most, if not all, district heat networks throughout Europe, the price that the customer pays tracks electricity, which actually tracks gas. So I don't know, is that correct, to be honest?
Here's the chart. So that's the district heating prices versus gas and electricity prices in Denmark over the last few years, and you can see they're very different from each other. So maybe have a look at that one, Donal, on the price. And then on the other one, the zoning, I think there'll maybe come a time where that conversation may happen in Ireland, but I don't think that's something that's needed from day one when there's nothing. I think in the UK they kind of started with trying to get some initial projects moving, and then they moved into looking, now that they know what the industry is and the industry has got established, then looking to set zones. And I think that will be what we need to do in Ireland as well, is just try and get the initial projects moving and started, and then as the project is up and running, or as the industry is up and running, I think then we will say, now that we have an idea of what the industry looks like, we can start to see where it could be or not be at that stage. I think if we try to map perfection from day one, I think we could end up spending a lot of time, as I said, talking about projects rather than the doing of them, whereas I think if we start and get some done, we'll learn an awful lot more and be in a much better position to decide what zones are suitable or not suitable, or what way the things should be zoned in over time. But I don't know, Pauline, if you have some comments.
Sorry, David, just on that chart, I can't actually see that chart. Are the slides going to be made available to participants? But what I suspect is what that chart is showing is wholesale gas prices versus domestic district heat network per kilowatt hour prices. What would be good is compare domestic gas prices to domestic heat network prices.
Yeah, I'd say do that. Not that I'm aware of, Donal. I think this is from the Consumer Protection Agency in Denmark, where they compared, as far as I know, end users' prices on different things. But I get your point about district heating networks that are based on heat pumps, but in Denmark a large amount of projects are not currently based on heat pumps. They're based on waste heat recovery, wood chip systems, other types of fuels as well. So there's some that might be linked to electricity, some are not, and I think this is just the summary of what all of the networks across the 300 different systems did during that time. So it's probably an average of what all of them did with, I'm sure if you went into the 300, some of them probably did track if they were heavily dependent on heat pumps. Some of them probably reduced that weren't at all dependent on heat pumps, but I'm sure the slides will be made available and you can have a look at the data yourself.
Thank you.
I'll just come in on the first question there, Donal. I mean, we are talking about a lengthy enough project to get, we'll say, half of Ireland into district heating networks. What we're currently seeing with the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment is the discussions really around a piece of legislation, the heat bill, that will have, I suppose, the foundations of district heating, will enable it, you know, have a licensing system that will make it easier so that we can get things off the ground. But then in secondary legislation, in regulations, over time those will change as you develop out networks. So I think at this point it's too early, but absolutely down the road we do need to look at zoning or mandating public authorities to do district heating rather than do something else which is going to put more pressure on the grid or certainly not reduce it. And when we look at the levels of the shocking levels of decarbonisation in the heat sector versus something like electricity, and something has to be done about it. But we take the approach that we need a few examples. Go back to my earlier point around solar panels. We want people to feel encouraged and hopeful and feel like it's worthwhile getting involved in at this stage.
I might just, I used to live in a city called Ulbor, which is 250 people in northern Jutland, and from memory about half of the heat for that entire city came from Ulbor Portland, if any of you ever heard of that, which is a very famous brand of cement that is used around the world. So we had an extremely cheap heat bill every year because that waste heat was there no matter what was going on in international markets. So it's just an example of one network where, you know, maybe Ireland won't be able to do that in all networks. I think Donald's probably has a point that some, like ours in Galway, will start depending on heat pumps, but right now we don't even have the opportunity to do that because we don't have the pipes in the ground to do that. So I think there's lots of places where I think that will come, maybe not all, but I think it's far more than zero, which is what we currently have today.
Have we identified any waste heat in Galway to suppliers?
You want to ask us, Brendan?
I have three questions, maybe.
There is some, so I think some of the ones that were jumped out to us initially was the wastewater treatment plant in Mullen Island would be a very regular source of waste heat, but it was just too far from where we were on Galway East. We didn't find any data centres when we went on our search, you know, so that was something we looked to see, was there anything that had waste heat in the area that could be used. There was none that we found, and we haven't either found today any industrial processes that have any, so that would have been something we looked for. But I would say industrial processes are probably the most difficult to find because it's so bespoke from site to site. Like, you could literally go on to two plants that manufacture the exact same product, and one could have it because they did something in 1980 that the other on the road didn't do. You know, so it's a very hard thing to unlock as well. It's not an easy thing to be generic about, whereas other things like a wastewater treatment plant or a data centre, you can kind of make some generic assumptions before you go looking. So short answer is I think there is some around Galway, but not near enough us for now. Maybe they'll get near to other branches as they develop, or maybe some will come over time.
Sorry, Grattan. We've one more from one person online, but then if we can hold the Q&A, because we will have a panel talk too, so some of the questions may be answered there, and you can ask again afterwards if that's okay. So can we have one more from Shona online, please? No, she's not on mute. You get the last one then.
Go on.
Thank you very much. How are you planning on sourcing the electricity, and do you anticipate any kind of PPA arrangement with renewable generators, or are you just going to buy from a supplier and they're using certificates to make it a green, or how are you planning on doing that? Esbjerg, I just wondered what kind of hydrogen plant is that? Natural gas conversion, or is that electrolyzer? The gentleman online seemed to say it was electrolyzers.
In Esbjerg?
Yeah, electrolyzers. And the third question was, how come it's local city planning as opposed to strategic infrastructure?
So it doesn't meet the thresholds for SID. Okay. It's a long way below. And the first one was
electricity source.
If the volume can be procured through PPA, we'll absolutely do that, but it'll probably depend on the time we get closer to operation. Is there a volume available? We do just happen to have a sister company that builds wind farms and corporate PPAs for a living, so we're we're probably very well placed to do that, but it'll be made, that decision will be locked in much closer to operation, because the time horizon now at the moment is too uncertain to make a deal on a corporate PPA.
As well, I'd like to welcome Pauline, and I'm not too sure about welcoming you the amount of times you've mentioned Mayo after the weekend now, but welcome to the stage. So, there was a lot of talk today, Dave, I like your quotes about stop it talking and start doing. So I'd love to focus on that, on how district heating can actually be brought forward, how we can get it delivered, how we can make the West a flagship area first, and what lessons Galway could adopt nationally. So I'm going to start with you, Pauline. So from a national perspective, what needs to change for district heating to genuinely take off in Ireland, not just in pilots and scales? You mentioned the 5 million and the 100 million earlier. So is that going to help towards what needs to happen as well?
Yeah, so look, I mean, a lot of people will have heard of Climate Action Fund, Pathfinder projects, and that's what council have been using. They've been using small amounts of money from Pathfinder or from Climate Action Fund to run feasibility studies across their counties, which is great, but even if we had a feasibility study for every single county in the country, how does that move us on to then saying, yeah, it's feasible here, but actually it's something that's going to benefit the community? And I'm a great believer in having your climate action plans, but I think a lot of councils and local authorities in particular are then struggling with getting to the next stage. So that's really what the pre-development fund is for. It's so that it's not just local authorities, but it's broader than that. It's anyone who has an offering and has a plan for district heating to get them to the planning stage. So what we will see out of this is probably March time, the allocation of that funding. They are whittling down at the moment from all of the applications that came in. What they wanted was to see what might be further down the road. So after this first phase, are there other projects, which I think was a really good approach. And then following that, we would hope that a number of the projects will then have that lifeline to keep them going while they're having the discussions with the anchor customers like the universities, like the hospitals. And then the 100 million comes into play, and that is to support up to 50% grant funding for the infrastructure for district heating networks. And now that we know that it's on the table, my experience is a minister doesn't want to have got that money and then give back that money. That's the worst possible outcome for a minister who's committed, gone on the record, come to our conference and said, here's what we're doing, here's the amount of money, and then at the end of the year, or a couple of years, says, didn't manage to spend it. And they've had to do that in a number of cases, and no minister wants that. So it's all on the political system to make it a reality, which is kind of what we're using to drive this forward.
Excellent. So where does the West fit into that national picture then, and what sort of advantages or disadvantages do cities like Galway actually have?
Well, you know, as you know, this is my city, and Galway, so I was delighted, and some people say that I've manipulated the system so that it's Galway first, but it's not true. That the work's been ongoing here in Galway for a long time. I think that one of the advantages is, well, it's a university town for one thing. Like you've got kind of big institutions, and I think Dave mentioned as well, a lot of people have to come to Galway for their services, like their hospitals and so on. So it's compact, you know, it's compact, and it's now, we talk about this when we talk about the glues as well for Galway, like anything like that, it's kind of comparable, that you've got a long kind of pathway, and then people branch off it on either side, but they don't go really, really wide. So I think that's really good. And you've also got the energy. I mean, lots of people, I was up in Dublin yesterday with the SAI and talking about Energy West, you know, this organisation. And I think that kind of momentum does drive change as well. It's the credibility, it's the feeling that people here want it to happen, and then you invest if you feel that people want it to happen.
Yeah, and I think the attendance in the room tonight and online just shows how invested people are in this in the west of Ireland. And I know we have it as part of our logo, but I really hope that the conversations we have after this can catalyse some of the action. So David, you mentioned district heat wasn't in the conversation, which obviously has an impact on planning for what you want to do. So from a delivery perspective, does the national policy framework currently help or hinder projects like Galway, and where do you see the biggest gaps in that outside of the planning?
Yeah, there's probably, so I'd say maybe just going back a couple of steps, when I moved home in 2017 and having coming out of what is equivalent to the mecca of district heating in Scandinavia, I'd say I spent the vast majority of my first 3 to 5 years at home explaining what it was, you know, which is a very strange thing to do for something that you're so used to having lived with for so long. It's like if someone came into this room and said, wow, how does that electricity work, David? You kind of look at them and go, it's very straightforward, but we've had it for quite a while, and you can imagine that it's, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that is kind of how you're, like I'll give you another example. One of my Danish friends came over for a visit once, and they were going to have a shower after I had a shower, and I said, oh, just hold on a sec, I have to throw on the immersion. He looked at me and said, sorry, you have to do what? I said, the hot water has run out. What do you mean hot water has run out? Where's the water gone? Because I could leave a tap on in Copenhagen 24/7 and water just continues to come through hot, because that's the utility, just like the electricity doesn't run out in the building. But that's their life, and it's back to what Pauline mentioned, that they don't ask where it comes from, they don't sit there and go, what's producing it? It just is a utility that comes through the wall as a product that they buy. And when you leave that world, and you know, in my experience of living there, I didn't experience major variations in price, and you look at the carbon intensity thresholds of what they produce, their heat is produced at about 80-90% less carbon than we produce heat today, so they're doing it low carbon, they're doing it relatively stable prices for everything I experienced anyway while I was living there, and they're doing it in a really high quality service that people don't do. And when you're in that world and then you come home and you say, geez, we should really do this, and people look at you and go, I've never even heard of it. You know, it's a hell of a gap that you've just gone from. You've gone from, this is like state of the art, been around for 30, 40 years, it's provided immense security of supply and quality of life benefits. And yet in Ireland in 2017, I would say the vast majority of conversations were, I don't even know what it is. I remember actually when we set up, just another funny story around just where we're at in Ireland to some degree, like we brought in a very reputable consultancy at one point to do some work for us in heat grid, and it was only in the middle of an update meeting that they realised there was 2 pipes. And I was like, yeah, there's a flow and return. But like that's the level we're kind of coming off. We're coming off just the absolute basic, you know, this is what it is. And I'd say the last 2 years in particular, and Pauline probably saw this herself, I think we've started a hockey stick, you know, as in we were at those levels 2017, 18, I suppose I started the clock at 17 because it's when I moved home, so it's probably just where I have my reference point at, but you know, it was very, very slow yards and very, very inch by inch up until then. Last year or 2 years, it's absolutely taken off, I think, in terms of that level of understanding, that level of what this solution has to offer, understanding what its role is in the decarbonisation journey, understanding what benefits it brings in terms of security of supply, which, by the way, just to make it clear, Scandinavia did it for security of supply reasons, not decarbonisation reasons. It was not a green move back in the 70s or 80s, it was a security of supply move on the back of the oil crisis. So like, I think all of those are so much more well understood. I think Pauline has done an unbelievable job at kind of keeping that as part of the kind of policy discussion that's gone on over the last 12 months. And then when you pare that down to then the reality of trying to build a project, like I'd say the current landscape is very tough, but not impossible. And I would say the biggest thing I worry about sometimes with policy is that they'll make it impossible by doing something they don't mean to do. You know, as in, there's many a time in the wind energy business I suffered through things that people were doing that with all the good intentions, they suddenly made a change on a certain thing that you're going to, geez, that actually is going to make things more difficult or more complicated. And I think there's lots of opportunities we have on the policy landscape to make things easier. I think there's lots of ideas IrDEA sharing about how to make it easier, but I think the main thing we need to do is not make it any harder, you know. And I think this is where I'd say, you know, that famous old phrase of perfection is the enemy of the good is absolutely the case with district heating. This constant striving for the perfect ownership model and the perfect district heating system and the perfect way to use waste heat has meant we sit constantly trying to find this non-existent perfect answer that isn't in the real world. The real world is just get something started, make a few mistakes, I'm sure, along the way of, right, there was ways to do it better, learn how to do it better going forward, iterate through that process, and at least you'll come out the other end with hopefully networks that are citywide, that can be used for waste heat, that can make cities more sustainable. But that's a lot better than this perfection is the enemy of the good piece at the start, where we all strive for all these perfect things that mean we never actually do anything other than dream of the day the perfect answer comes. And I think that's what I would say. I'd say, yeah, lots of things policy could do to make our life easier. I could list them all out, but just make sure whatever policy does, make sure we don't stop it. And I won't go any more out and talk a long time, but I'd say the last line I leave you with is funding is the most critical thing policy can do, and we can talk about that later if it comes up.
It's actually, that's what we tell our startups to build, get feedback, iterate. So it's a very similar journey, and including the funding. I'm going to touch on what you said there about energy security, so I'll bring back to you. Given our current geopolitical uncertainty, which you touched on earlier, and those energy security concerns, how does district heating strengthen Ireland's ability to secure its heat supply long term?
Well, time was, if you had an oil reserve or a gas reserve, you were creating electricity or economic position globally. And actually, we're looking at it from the perspective of having a natural resource. We have all of the natural resources that we need, or all of the resources that we need to completely heat the entire island right here from everything we have. It's spoken about the data centres, not just the data centres, but waste heat in general. We have enough to heat every building in the country. We don't need to go outside. So it doesn't make any sense to be going on the global market. We saw with Ukraine how the prices shot up. If we had had district heating at the time, we would have been far more stable. I think Scandinavia found that they didn't have those price increases that we suffered here. But of course, if we keep waiting and if we keep prolonging the decision about what to do, we'll see even more problems, geopolitical problems that come. We actually just have to make a decision and just get going and just do it so that we are insulated and protected the next time around. The great thing about district heating is that you can use any form, any heat source. So you can switch in and out if you want to. Thermal storage, we haven't spoken about thermal storage, but that's also hot topic across Europe in discussing district heating, and certainly in the TAL project. That's what they're doing at the moment, is they're putting in thermal storage. So that gives you kind of the security there, a security blanket that if you lose supply in one area, you've still got it. And so look, all round, it just is a no-brainer, but what I'm finding is that civil servants know this, but it's just, the process is so slow to just get it moving and get that funding to people. So hopefully, fingers crossed, this year will kind of change the dial, and I think the last few months have made a big difference in terms of giving investors the security that they need to move forward with their projects. As I say, because of those funding announcements, even though they are small, and I know they sound small, but it's also the signal that it sends. I think that's the critical piece, the credibility.
So do you believe we've gone past that educational piece that you were trying to drive in 2017 into awareness now?
I wouldn't say we have, really. I think that most people do not understand what district heating is at all. I think that we do need to do more on that. But if I'm looking at it, you could invest a massive amount of money in an advertising campaign to explain to people what district heating is, or you could get a couple of projects started and people could see what district heating is. And I think that that's the best approach. Yes, we have to keep with the education piece, and we've done pieces on local radio here in Galway, in Limerick, in Waterford, as part of Renewable Energies Ireland. I've done a couple of pieces nationally, and as I said at the start, when going into Leinster House, no TD, no senator had a clue about district heating. Pretty much not one, other than Darragh Ryan, that was under his ministry. So that has shifted, but people need to feel, politicians need to feel that their constituents are also on board. So there is the two pieces to bring together. But opportunities like this are great, where people can hear from the horse's mouth what the project in their local area is going to look like and ask questions. And that's partly what IrDEA is about. We represent local authorities, we represent Team Dublin, as I said, we represent developers, and so across the board we have all of the information people need. We have working groups then on funding, on policy side. Isla McCormick's here as well as another one of our members over the tax incentivisation piece that we're looking at the moment, and then we're looking to set up another work group now on public procurement, which I know a lot of people here will be really interested in, that public procurement piece, which I know people feel is a barrier. We feel that it's not the barrier that it needs to be, but people need to know how to progress it, you know.
I might just add, because I think Pauline is spot on, but the one thing I just add as a footnote is there's a minimum critical mass of people that need to be informed to just get us started, and I think we're very close to that cusp. You know, funding being allocated, the recognition of its role in decarbonisation, and I think the last piece of the critical mass, kind of building on Pauline's point about the public procurement stuff, is just making sure we're offering something that the customers who we're ultimately providing with are aware of all the benefits that we're bringing for their problems. Because, like, I think that's I think there's, you know, if you look at there's a million people, you'd like if everyone knew what district heating is, but you don't need everyone to know to just get started. You need a certain core group of people to know what it is to get started. And I feel like 2026 is maybe the first time we'll get the whole critical mass we need for the first projects to just start going. And I just think that last piece is, you know, you have people like us getting projects through planning, you have the government and stuff supporting projects with grant support, but we just need to make sure then that we can demonstrate the benefits that I outlined in my presentation to the people that ultimately have to sign contracts to buy heat from these networks. And I think that's back to large private customers that have large heat loads, it's into public sector anchor customers that have large heat loads, and I think that's probably the last piece of the jigsaw for the first projects to be able to move. And then, as Pauline flagged in her talk, you know, which I think you did a great job going back to your political days of doing, I couldn't do that outside, but you know, when people get that first projects moving and see, geez, I can see the benefit now, and I believe it's possible to do this, I think you'll see the snowball start to move out of the critical mass into maybe wider knowledge, you know. And I think that's, for me, I always look at it from, because I just trying to get the first ones moving, is just getting to that critical mass point, and I think that's getting very close, you know, and especially compared to where we were 3, 4, 5 years ago, I think it's really close.
So how do you convince those public sector bodies about the real advantages for them to become your anchor customers beyond the decarbonisation headlines?
I think what you know, the experience of our members is that many of these large anchor customers want district heating. So I suppose that's the first thing. They want district heating, but it's the next stages and how you actually go from wanting it to getting it over the line. I think the HSE, the Higher Education Authority, themselves as bodies need to be on board, and it is something that we're discussing at a national level with bringing the overall national bodies on board, because there aren't the barriers there that people fear. It doesn't make sense for these authorities to be giving funding into individual heat pumps and not into district heating. It just defies logic. And so getting that piece right, and getting an actual process in place where people say there's an out-of-the-box thing that I can follow to get my hospital along that journey, I think that's really what is needed at this point. But we're at the point now where we're having the discussions and explaining from our members' points of view to the department, here are the barriers that we're coming across. What can you do in order to remove that barrier for us as an industry? And when I say industry, go back to the point, it is public and private bodies that we're representing in this. Everybody wants the same outcome here, and that is district heating in their areas.
Going to bring it back local for a moment. So you've already discussed the gas pipelines in your presentation about how that's very important to have those supply, and the fact that Galway with the universities and the hospitals and all that is a great area. You said specifically Galway East was attractive. So why was that chosen as a project in the first place over any of the other cities across Ireland?
So I'd say we started with about 3 to 5 that we thought could be the first initially. I think one of the most defining factors initially was when we first presented projects to the various local authorities, the level of support we got from there. Because you're never doing one of these projects unless a local authority is on board with what you're doing. You know, they are probably the single biggest stakeholder we have in these types of projects, considering what we're hoping to do with roads and networks and things. So like, I think after we did that, there was a short list of about 2 or 3 actually that we thought could then be the first. So that kind of brought us right down from our initial screening of Ireland into 5 or 6 short listed areas. Then we had 3 that we felt we were getting really strong momentum with the local authorities in those towns and cities. And then it became a case of like how fast could we develop the basics, the fundamentals of the project in terms of, can we find a place to locate our energy centre? Can we find anchor customers that would be big enough and near enough to make this, the tagline I would use, to make sure that we could offer the best value way to decarbonise. This is back to the threshold that we set ourselves is, we'd love to be able to say we can beat fossil fuels, but we just can't at the moment, and we don't have a way of doing it. So then the next bar is, right, if we can offer the lowest cost way to decarbonise, then we have an attractive proposition for customers, hopefully, because if we're the cheapest way to meet targets or meet objectives, then that makes us a compelling offer versus something else. So if we feel we can meet that threshold, it's, can we find a place to put our energy centre while still doing that? Can we find a route for our pipe network that's viable to still do that? And by the time you go through all of those steps, because they take quite a long time to work their way right down to the stage where you're far enough along to submit a planning application, then that's what's defining what comes out of the conveyor belt first, you could say. And we happen to make really good progress with that in Galway in terms of working our way through all the, plenty of setbacks along the way, plenty of roller coasters up and down, but it just happened to be that project that we pieced together all the various components of what made up the planning application first on. And hopefully that momentum will continue. There's plenty more steps to go to get that project to heat on. There's lots of more things to be finalised post-planning and everything, but right now it's the first we have, and hopefully others will follow.
And can you explain why then residential wasn't, those connections weren't as a starting point set up?
Yeah, so I'd say the best analogy I have is if you take it in, it's just because of what we're familiar with in Ireland. People will look out and see there's very big electrical cables that go all the way across the country from Dublin to Clare, in particular, these large 220 or 400 kV lines. You don't connect them to a house, as in you have to build the first large piece of network and then you build the smaller pieces of network. But you do design the big network going across the country to be able to service the houses when you get to build the smaller branches. And the district heating is exactly like that. You're building the first piece of pipe, which is your big piece of spine network that's going to connect the larger users, but you can't just plug a single house into the big pipe because it's not built for that type of connection. But you do oversize it so that over the next 20, 30 years, it's big enough to connect clusters as they come on. So day one, they're not part of the initial connections because of that. You're building the biggest pipe first, but they are very much part of the plan for the project over time to then come online after the project is initially constructed. And the way that usually happens is, if I ever look at our Dutch business, which is 12, 15 years down the road, so they have a number of projects live and working. It's kind of like telecoms in Ireland as well to some degree. You'll find clusters along the route where once you hit a minimum threshold of people that are willing to connect, you'll connect that cluster of places in groups. And that's how you tend to bring the smaller consumers on board. So that's the time horizon is very much part of the plan, but it has to come in a certain sequence due to the way the networks have to be designed.
Just to add on to that, I suppose the easiest ones to bring on board would be new developments. So that what we're really looking to make sure is that this accelerating infrastructure plan that the government is talking about, that district heating is part of that plan, because you don't want to have to then go back and retrofit homes that were only built a couple of years ago to district heating. And Dublin City Council do have it as part of a planning condition that new builds should be district heating enabled already. So we're kind of trying to make sure that that's a reality, that that's enforced, but that's something that any local authority could do if it is investing in district heating. It's a way to future-proof it. The retrofitting of older homes is harder, but part of the conversation around Dublin, interestingly, was how do you decarbonise old Dublin, say Georgian Dublin, and you can't do it through retrofitting and through individual heat pumps. So district heating actually is an ideal opportunity for some of those really historical parts of our cities, and that I think is a really exciting thing. So I suppose watch this space as these networks develop.
I'm gonna have a weird time at the moment, so I'm gonna throw it open to the floor and online for loads. Okay, I saw you first.
It's Bill Noon, League Service Engineer, Galway University, retired. I'd like to ask David about the temperature which you're supplying commercial buildings at, because if you feed their existing calorifers at 80 degrees C, they're only getting 60 out on the secondary side. I thought the ideal temperature would be 120 degrees C and 3 or 4 bar pressure. And also, heat metering has been very on and off over the years, not very accurate. And would you be able to supply commercial buildings at 15 cents per kilowatt hour to make it competitive?
So the temperature-wise, we're pretty much, I suppose, balancing two sides to that. One is any more than 80 and using a heat pump starts to become very, very challenging. So you're kind of limited to that. And in most of the buildings that we've been in, 80 degrees will do the vast majority of most buildings' heat. And conscious that some older buildings in particular, that's not the case.
True, except in the college where we had our own internal network. We were starting off, say, at 120 degrees C and feeding 6 different buildings. And then they were coming out at 80 degrees C on the secondary side. But you wouldn't actually, you'd have to change that actually if you were supplying that particular grid, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think when we sometimes arrive into buildings like that, especially I would say university and hospital contexts, you just have to concede that you can't meet the demands that are at those temperature levels. So then you look to see, right, if this hospital or university or whatever the building may be, but they're probably the most typical ones that have that, especially in say hospitals might need steam for sterilisation of certain things, so they just can't take that off steam or high temperature levels. Is how much of the heat load could we take if we arrived at 80 degrees? And then what people will find is it's an awful lot cheaper to convert maybe 80-90% of their demand to 80 degrees than it would be to put in fabric upgrades or stuff like that. So it's never a kind of one-size-fits-all answer, and especially when you get into those kind of older buildings and more complex existing heating systems. But I would say we rarely arrive into a site where you can't do a fairly significant chunk at 80 degrees. For us, we'd like to get at least a 25-degree delta back off the customer. I think in Ireland, you know, we'd often come across deltas of 5-10 degrees and you'd kind of gasp when you see it. But I don't think there was a huge incentive historically for people to widen their deltas because the boilers didn't care. You know, there wasn't really that, you know, just the boilers can manage it, so there wasn't. So we often find there's actually quite a lot of low-hanging fruit of things you can do in the plant room to widen those deltas from what they historically would have been. Maybe just changing the way the circuits are shared or changing loads to different orders. So often we find it's like you arrive in day one and it's like, oh geez, no, we can't. But actually they've never actually asked the question because it never needed to be asked in the past. So I think we find we can do a lot of things relatively, certainly much less intrusively than having to change heating systems inside the buildings.
Yeah, because it's ideal for the hot water.
Exactly, yeah. So I think there's things you can often do there that, you know, like it's funny again going back to like, you know, the Danish experience, there was companies that specifically set up themselves to be advisors and contractors to do that type of work as people got connected. And so there's a whole fountain of knowledge of doing all of that. And I think Ireland will need it for heat pumps as well as district heating, by the way. I think that problem is going to be there no matter what way you decarbonise. It's not a district heating specific problem. But I think there's an awful lot of knowledge we just never really had to know in Ireland, when actually the simple answer was just turn up the boiler, and it fixes the problem.
Yeah, sorry, I know you were talking about district heating, but have you thought about district cooling as well? For hospitals and stuff?
Yeah, so I thought about it for a very short period of time. And, I think from what we've done, I don't see the buildings in the areas we've looked at having sufficient loads to justify putting networks in the ground. I think the levels that you need in Ireland, and also the extreme peaky nature of when it's needed, just we haven't found an area that we would say is dense enough to do it. And I suppose I should just caveat with, we haven't done a lot of work in Dublin City, for example, because that's currently not a place private developers can do work in. So there might be things when you get into that really heavy, densely commercial and hotel areas in Dublin that it might be. But in everything we've looked at today, the volumes of cooling we found haven't been sufficiently high enough to start looking at pipes in the street. And then, as you probably know, the size of the pipes gets quite larger for the district cooling world, which I think as well is another thing to factor in when you're trying to do something for the first time. So both of those, we haven't had anything concrete, we haven't a specific project that we've looked at to date with that.
I just come in there just to say that the Irish District Energy Association had to be explained to me. Actually, the reason it's energy is because it's both heating and cooling. But even if you're to look at it at the European level, where there is a huge amount of district heating, there's one particular guy in every meeting of the Euro Heat and Power who says, don't forget about cooling in every meeting, because everybody does forget about cooling. I think it's going to be definitely part of the conversation as Europe gets warmer and warmer and there is more necessity for cooling. We're just so far away from having district heating even, and got the idea of trying to remember the cooling bit for people, I think is a step too far.
I think one thing I would say about cooling though, which is, I think it helps with the Irish discussion, is the second biggest district cooling system in all of Europe is in Helsinki. And I think that is something to just think about, that Irish people would have often said in many conversations I was in, especially the early days of trying to explain why district heating should be something we look at, oh sure, it's not hot enough. And that is not what defines district heating. It's not about how hot it is, it's about how much heat you use in a small area. And I think that Helsinki has the second biggest district cooling network in all of Europe. They're not a hot place, they're cold, they don't have a huge summer that has loads of temperature, but again, it's just maybe, I think it helps show that district heating and district cooling, they're not how hot is it outside or how cold is it inside type of technology. It's just about how close are buildings located to one another, and how much energy do they use for that purpose over the whole year is what defines if building a network is possible. But I think it is a bit of a fun fact that Helsinki has the second biggest district cooling network in all of Europe.
Have we any questions online at the moment? Any more in the room before? Paul?
Hi, thanks guys. This is totally amazing. It's blowing my mind. Pauline will know that. But you mentioned significant barriers in relation to policy and in relation to funding. If those barriers were dropped tomorrow, is there any other kind of major headaches that setting up a district heating network in a city like Galway? What are the real bigger headaches that you see can be major problems?
Well, I suppose Dave can talk about his real world experience of trying to get these things over the line over long periods of time. I'd say his list of barriers is probably much longer than mine. But certainly from the policy point of view, there aren't that many policy barriers really. It's more the perception of policy barriers that's the issue. And I think that's the bit that we have to break down. I spoke about the procurement issue there. If there's a perception across various public bodies that procurement is an issue, then we have to address that, even though, speaking with the SAI yesterday, speaking with the department, there is no issue around procurement. But we need that message to get beyond the department officials and the SAI into a concrete way that public bodies can use and have a cheat sheet and say, well, here's how I get through the process. And I think it's more around that rather than the actual policy barrier. And I do think credibility is an issue. Most people are on board once they understand what it is, but because we don't have a network at all, people still say, oh, sure, that will never work. And people say that about everything, you know, and then they say it until it does work. So I think that the way to build credibility is by getting a couple of projects over the line. And I have to say, the Minister's Special Advisor in particular is mad about district heating. She just loves district heating. When we went in to meet with the Minister, he said, she's always talking about district heating. You know, and you do need a few people in key kind of positions who are willing to keep reminding people. You remember you said now about the thing you were going to do. You know, it's a human kind of a thing that actually we need a few leaders. And in the local authorities, we've seen that are the most successful in terms of getting the feasibility studies done early. There's a key person in there that you could identify is the person who, when you meet them, you go, now I understand why it's this local authority and not that local authority that is moving forward with these feasibility studies. Now, we want to get beyond feasibility studies, but that's where we are at the moment. So I don't see there's many barriers. I think the funding is an absolute barrier. Like, I spoke to one local authority, an engineer in a local authority, and he said it's the only reason that we're not moving forward with district heating is we get grant funding for this thing, but we get no grant funding for that. It's an obvious one, and we have managed to break through on that. But we could do more. We could do an awful lot more on that funding. The spark gap, which David kind of mentioned, that the price of gas is obviously, that's an ongoing issue, but that's an issue everywhere. That's an issue for individual heat pumps. It's an issue right across Europe that has to be resolved to bring those prices closer together. But it's not a barrier in getting it off the ground, because we are starting with a model which is about decarbonisation.
I'll take the final question from down the back and then I'll let you break. You can talk to them. Are you staying around afterwards for a little while? Yeah. David is anyway.
And this is pretty much my home, so
Very love being here.
I'll stand up, these chairs are really low. Massively supportive of district heating. A couple of questions. Worked on a scheme in the UK in Bristol, which has got a quite extensive network there, which they are extending. One of the problems that they faced is around customer connections and that transparency around pricing. And I know we've talked about kind of the ambition here, and it's kind of getting off the ground. But what does that pricing look like? What is the mechanisms for customers in the future, and how will that compare? Because you're going to have to build up from a low base to become more developed.
I think actually it goes back to what I would add to Pauline's as the reason I think funding is the single biggest showstopper is I think if we can offer better prices, the faster district heating will move. Like, I think grant funding comes and it means you can half the price you're offering to customers. That's half the challenge in my mind of people being able to say they'll go ahead with it. And I think that's what the biggest barrier I think district heating faces in Ireland today, as much as I know Pauline's right, I have a long list, but I think the only one on the list that I think the one that will mean we do nothing versus we do something is getting those grant supports through so that we can offer a price that people can afford to pay. Because I think if we can't get customers, as you say, to agree to buy the heat from us, we can't build a project. I think it's a voice that is probably far more important even than mine in this conversation. Like, we're developing projects, but I think the people that will define the success or not of this industry won't be us as developers, it'll be the customers that are willing to sign up or not. Because I think no matter how good you develop a project, if there isn't a customer willing to sign up on the other end of that project, no matter how good you are, you haven't. And I think that's why the funding piece is always the one that I keep coming back to, because not too dissimilar to Pauline's experience, like we would meet customers where we can say, yeah, I can offer you a much cheaper price than putting in a heat pump, but they'll turn and say, well, I can get 90% grant funding for the heat pump, so it doesn't make sense to go with your much cheaper offer. So I think that's where, if even we got a level playing field, we'd be able to do an awful lot of things much faster. Sorry, I know, just going back to your specific question though, I think the way that we will envisage our projects, and I suppose I'm speaking very much now as just what we do, and members who are developing projects may do things differently, but like our approach with customers is that we will have contracts between us as HeatGrid and those customers that are extremely extensive and have been negotiated through in many occasions in our sister company with fairly large public sector entities and private sector entities, that lists out a whole stream of what we are required to provide them with in terms of reliability, servicing times, response times. There's financial penalties if we don't make sure the heat is available at certain times. And I think for the next few years, due to the very sophisticated nature of the counterparties we're talking about as anchor customers, that will provide the foundation of negotiations and comfort to people that they are getting protections that they need. In other words, what I'm trying to say about that is it's not going to be relying on some national regulation. In my view, I think customers will be far more keen to make sure that the contract they sign with us has the commitments they need to be comfortable with, and that we're accountable to those commitments and those contracts, than they are going to be on some national policy that's made. Because ultimately it's that contract that they can use to say that we're not living up to our requirements. And that's the way we present it, and that's the way I think things will start. And I think over time then more things will become more standardised at national level. They become bigger role for the regulator, I'm sure, over time. But I think it will probably start very much as a bilateral contract negotiation agreed between a small number of very large users who I think are in a very capable position to negotiate that because of their makeup. They're not going to be, they're going to be well used to agreeing contracts for different things because of the type of customers that they are.
Just that question triggered a thought that I've been brewing in my head. You know me as an old policy wonk, David, and I've had this for years.
What's coming, Graham?
I know you know what's coming. Connection costs.
Yeah.
A big old barrier. We seem to get it absolutely wrong in this country. And just in case people in the room don't know, when you try to connect a wind farm or a solar project or any other generation project, you have to pay for the connection, but you can never own the connection. So that causes the highest possible barrier to getting into the business. And I'm just wondering, there are two aspects to the question, I suppose. One is, when you build your grid, is it the city that's going to own it, or are you going to own it privately?
Us.
Us, oh, okay. And then the second one is, how will the connection charging work? Well, if you're a private entity, you'll understand the connection charging problem. But is there a risk that where the city decides it's got to own the pipe work, it's going to and then be subject to regulation from CRU, presumably?
At the same time, I'd say both. So the first thing to say is it's very normal in Europe for private entities to own district heating networks. It's not normal in Europe for private companies to own electricity or gas networks. And so if you walked in, not in Denmark, I would say that's one very unusual situation, because they have a very specific ownership model that are co-op structures in Denmark. So I've never seen it anywhere except Denmark, and I've lived there and it works great. It's just, I can't ever see that being transferable to many other places because it's a very unique cultural thing that they have. But if you go into Sweden, Malmö, 300,000 people, privately owned network. Lund, 10 kilometres up the road, 60,000 people, publicly owned network. Stockholm has switched hands a number of times between public and private owners. So it's probably just one to let you know it's not unusual in the world of district heating, because district heating is a very local network. And that's how there tends to be different ownership models compared to electricity and gas being national networks with typically, you could say, pretty singular pricing. Like as in district heating, you can actually, there's a league table in both Denmark and Sweden where they compare all the prices of every network. Every one of them is different. Sweden has an online thing, you can see all the hundreds of networks and all their different prices, because that one, for example, I said in Aalborg, was located right beside a cement plant, one of the cheapest prices in the country. As Donald flagged, if you have a heat pump, you have to buy electricity for your heat. So other district heating networks in Denmark that are depending on electricity for their heat pump, much higher prices than you'd find in a city that has a waste heat source that they can tap into. So it's a very localized thing. Yeah. It's also, I would say, incredibly vertically integrated. So going back to the questions raised about supply temperatures and delta T's, what happens in the customer's building can define what we're doing in our energy centre. That's not really the case in electricity. You know, what you're doing with electricity in your house doesn't define what Money Point is doing in terms of its design of power production.
Delta T being the difference in temperature between the flow and return.
Yeah, so like you could go into one network, you know, Peter could absolutely own two networks in two different cities, but for one city we had to supply 85 degrees and for another we had to supply 60. And that would mean we have totally different options as to what we do in terms of producing our heat. That would have totally different options in terms of what we do in terms of offering prices. And so like that makes it a very vertically integrated business that becomes very difficult to say, sorry, we're going to chop off the middle and give it to someone else. You know, it becomes a very hard thing to do as a project because it's so integral to how the whole thing works together.
It's quite decentralised.
It's very decentralised, yeah, very decentralised. So yeah, so that all factors into what you then offer. You know, so if you sit in a city with a waste heat source, you can offer a totally different connection and heat rate model than if you sit in a city that isn't. So it's just, and then the only question that matters, and I've probably said this a number of times, is, and this is what I would say is the most important voice in the room, is at the end of all of that jigsaw, is what you're offering a competitive offer for the people who have to ultimately buy it. And I think that's the bar that no matter how it gets made up in the first part, if you don't land at a point that's competitive, you just forget it because you're not going to be able to make it a reality. And I think that's the goal. The goal is no matter how much the heat sources may be different, and the network lengths might be different, and the route might be different, or you might have a bridge or a tunnel or whatever it is, when it all gets wrapped up into a project, is the price that you can offer those anchors in particular and people over the long term something affordable. And if it is, you have a project. And if it isn't, you don't.
Thanks.
Right, just in case people have a hard stop at 5, we'll stop the questions there. I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming here today, and thank you to the Western Development Commission who have sponsored today's events. Also to the Portershed, particularly Anthony and Nigel, who've given a lot of time to helping this initiative get off the ground and get out there and get known to people. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank Pauline and David for your contribution today. We will be back in February with another event. We're hoping to make that a visualisation one, so to find out what you want from Energy West. But can we have a last round of applause for our two panelists today?
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Yeah, turn off the set.
I'll stand beside you.